Fatih is from
Yeah.
Fatih is from Izmir.
No, he's not from Izmir. He's from Istanbul.
Oh, no, I don't think I know. I thought
Okay.
Another Rotarian you must know is Korhan Attila.
okay, I know him.
Yeah.
Yep. I know him.
He has been very active with me in water projects around the world.
Okay, it's 12:15, so we can get started now. We have 61 people on, so as I said, people can join at any time. That's no problem. A few Zoom rules we'd like, in order to accommodate anyone. If we could stop for a minute and all go on mute, we'd appreciate it, so we don't have any background noises. So if everybody could put yourself on mute. If not, I will go through and put you on mute. We're going to take questions at the end. If you could just put them into the chat or save them to the end. And if there's time, we'll try to get to them all. We'd appreciate more questions than just comments. Somebody's not on mute. Could you go on mute, please?
Let me go back.
So we expect to conclude around 1:15. And first, as Rotarians, we'd like to start with our reflection, and that is going to be from one of our members of Rotary Toronto Eglinton, Bill Steele. Bill, do you want to do the reflection? Bill, are you here?
Yeah, the bill was advised, Don, so he on Zoom. Yeah,
I emailed with him a couple of days ago.
yeah, so he should be there.
Well, he doesn't seem to be responding.
No, I just looked through. I don't think he's there, Don.
No. Huh. Well, I guess we won't have a reflection after all, unless anybody has something they'd like to say.
Be sure you're on mute.
There you go. 15 minutes of fame shot to hell. All right. Well, I'm going to introduce the speaker who's introducing the speaker, and that might take me 15 minutes because it's Neelam Betty, who most of you seem to know more than just our club. He's a past president of Rotary Toronto Eglinton, and he's the chair of the Environmental Action Committee for District 7070. He's a Rotary cadre of technical advisors, community economic development from 2023 to 2025. He's the technical officer of SRAG, Environmentally Sustainability Rotary Action Group, and director of RAGSED, Rotary Action Group for Community Economic Development. You have a lot of titles, Neelam. Anyway, he's going to introduce our speaker, David Miller.
Thank you, Don. That was not needed. I'm just a member of this club. Anyway, it's really good to see so many attendees, not only from our club, but way beyond it, other Rotarians in the district and places far and wide, including Turkey, South Africa, and several places in the US. I assume you're all interested in the topic of climate change. Now, before I formally introduce our speaker today, I would like to make a few observations just to set the context. Now, why does climate change matter to Rotary and to Rotarians? Until a few years ago, the term climate change was absent from Rotary's language, its programming, and from its website. Rotary, as per its long track record, was working to improve lives across the globe through projects in a wide range of areas, such as basic education literacy, maternal child health, disease prevention, water and sanitation, peace and conflict, among others. Now, in the last year, a few years, there has been a shift. While Rotary continues to work in its traditional areas of focus, there is a clear recognition of the strong linkage between climate change and outcomes in all these other sectors. And while Rotary had already been working implicitly to redress the impacts of climate change, it now is explicitly working. It has a focus on climate change and connecting the dots between climate change and all its areas of focus. And as we speak, our current Rotary International President, Gord McInally, along with past President Barry Rassin, Secretary John Hugo, and a number of other representatives are on their way to COP28, where over 70,000 attendees from almost every country will be discussing actions on climate change. And these participants will include governments, business, civic organizations, youth groups, and anyone who is really worried about the future. And Rotary has a booth there and will be holding 28 sessions on various themes relevant to climate change. And today I'm delighted to welcome David Miller to speak to us about perhaps the most important issue of our times, climate change, and which has also been called an existential threat to civilization. I first met David over 20 years ago while he was running for mayor of Toronto, when a mutual acquaintance put him in touch with me to talk about putting a toll on selected highways as a mean of curbing gridlock. At the time, I was working in policy areas on innovative ways of getting to managing the environment, including the National Academy of the Sciences. And I quickly found out that he was not afraid of considering bold ideas. He did become the mayor of Toronto in 2003, but he already had many years of hands-on experience in and commitment to civic issues through his activism at the grassroots level and serving as a councillor at City Hall. And during his leadership as mayor between 2003 and 2010, Toronto became recognized internationally for its progressive policies on the environment, the economy, and social inclusion. And it was during his tenure as mayor that he chaired the global network of cities called C40 to confront the climate crisis. He then went on to show his leadership on a bigger stage. He was president and CEO of the World Wildlife Fund Canada between 2013 and 17, and after which he took on the mantle of being a managing director within C40. Now, he has numerous other accolades that are difficult to cover in the time that we are here today. So without taking much further time, I'd like to hand over the mic to you, David.
Yeah, and thank you very much for that really gracious and far too lengthy and generous introduction. But it does mean I'm going to have to tell a story, but I'll get my presentation up. First, I'm going to share my screen. Let me always seem to get this in the wrong order. All right, can people see a slide? Local governments are leading climate change. Oh, it's loading still.
Not yet, yeah.
Yeah, it's loading. So I just have to say, one of the things that accidentally made me the mayor was the issue of tolls. So thank you, Neelam, 20 years later for putting it in my head. What happened was I was scrummed by the media at City Hall, and I took the scrum a bit casually. And they said, I had very ambitious transit plans. They said, what if you don't get the money from Queen's Park and Ottawa to do them? And my response was, we'd have to consider tolls. and all hell broke loose politically. John Tory sent people to the debates, and we had a lot of debates. We had over 80 of them, I think, wearing bandanas, screaming out, "You're a highway robber," and trying to shout me down and not let me speak. But my response was, I was being honest. And it was very interesting because the other campaigns thought saying that would mean I'd lose. What happened was, because my response was I was being honest, I actually went up in the polls. So it was an interesting sort of political lesson. People actually are responsible and can take honesty despite what political advisors think. The screen share doesn't seem to be working yet. Am I right? It's not working still?
I think Dawn is sharing her screen, but she needs to change the setting to allow multiple participants to share the screen, Dawn.
Okay, well, it seems to allow me to click on share, but it isn't, it says it's loading and doesn't work. There we go. Okay, can you see it now? Yes. So
No, not here. We don't see it yet. Oh, okay, now we go.
I've got about 35 minutes because I'd like to leave 15 minutes for questions. So what I'm going to speak to is what I'm involved in today, and have been in one way or another really for a very long time, is about local government action on climate change. And my overall thesis is the science says we need to have overall global emissions by 2030. That's 6 years. People talk about net zero by 2050, that matters, but if we don't get where we need to by 2030, we can't get to where we need to by 2050. And the best way to have emissions by 2030 is not by inventing new things, because there's no time. It's by doing the things that work and doing them everywhere. And the place that that's actually happening is in cities. So that's what I'm going to speak to, and I'll reflect at the end on where I think Rotary can be particularly helpful a little bit as well, because the work you're doing matters. You know, Rotarians are everywhere, but mostly in cities, because that's where the people are. So I think, given the Rotary traditions of community service, there's a huge role that can be played. So I suspect everybody in this call knows the facts, but just to highlight them, we really have to act now. And if we don't, it's going to be too late. So we need to have emissions by 2030 globally. And, you know, there's some really interesting facts. It's the richest people in the world, the households in countries with the highest per capita income, that have contributed to most of the emissions. So it's, you know, United States, Canada, where Canada is disproportionate on a per capita basis. China, India will be a problem. And many countries, like the African countries, have very low emissions indeed. So the challenges are predominantly those in the global north and in China. This chart is busy, but I find it terrifying. This tells us what the emissions gap is. And what it says is the commitments over here on the right, the emissions gap in 2030, these are the commitments. NDC is a nationally determined contribution. Those are the commitments governments made in Paris. They're not remotely sufficient, and we're not meeting them. So we're on a trajectory that actually is going up. Maybe at the most optimistic, it's flattened a bit. It flattened during COVID, but it started to go up again, and we need to go down dramatically. That is a really serious worry. And of course, we're already seeing the effects, like the wildfires in British Columbia this year. The other background fact is that national governments aren't making their commitments. I made this slide in September. Might be possible that there's been a little bit of movement. One or two maybe are compatible. The Ghana was The Gambia, sorry, a year ago had a compatible trajectory and has fallen back. But basically, national governments are either insufficient or highly insufficient, including Canada. You know, so we see all the debate and the Premier of Alberta saying, you know, we can't possibly clean our energy sector, which is an outright lie. It's just false. She's deliberately trying not to clean the electricity sector, but you know, we think that's an isolated case, but actually we're not doing very well, despite the fact that the Liberals, the NDP, and the Bloc have all endorsed climate action, and that's true of most countries. That's the sad reality we face. In contrast, there is a huge movement for city-based climate action, and I'm going to speak today about what we're seeing and what the latest information is and why there's reason for hope, although we're getting very close to the point of no return. But the first thing is, you know, since about 2008, maybe a bit later, but it doesn't matter for the purposes of my presentation, the world became an urban world. Before 2008, and really since the dawn of human civilization, most people had lived outside cities. But since 2008 or so, the world is a majority urban world, and it's growing because of the building of megacities in China and India, and the mass migrations to urban areas in Africa and in many Latin American cities. So we're an urban world, our economy is in cities, and most greenhouse gas emissions are in cities because that's where most of the energy is consumed. Quite worryingly, in developing countries, a lot of that urban expansion is near hazard-prone areas like flooding. And quite famously, Jakarta, Indonesia, which is the capital, it's around 12 million people, it's sinking because of historic reasons, but also because of sea level rise and extreme storms related to climate. The president of Indonesia announced a couple of years ago that they're going to have to move Jakarta. 12 million people. And they're building a new city. But how, from a practical perspective, how do you move 12 million people? And that's really the tip of the iceberg. And Jakarta is similar to the world and to many cities. The people who are having the biggest impact from that flooding, from the sinking of the city, and from climate-related problems are the lowest income people in that city by far. So what are cities doing? Well, first of all, the best cities have plans. So C40 is an organization, as Neelam said, of the mayors of the world's biggest cities. It was an honor to have the chair when I was mayor of Toronto. It was a real honor that a Canadian city was chosen unanimously by its peers to lead this network. But it's cities like Jakarta, like Cape Town, like Istanbul, like Paris, like Beijing, like London, and of course, like Toronto. It was originally 40 cities, hence the name. It's been expanded, and it's now almost 100. After the Paris Agreement, C40, under the leadership of the then chair, Mayor Eduardo Paes from Rio de Janeiro, said to itself, what is the role of cities to ensure that the world avoids climate breakdown in a post-Paris world? And C40 had always been science-based. It was started in 2005 by Ken Livingston, and his basic idea was that the voices and the actions of the mayors of these major cities can help the world avoid climate breakdown. We eventually get to Paris. Parenthetically, the fact that it took 21 years for national governments to agree really, I think, indicates how entrenched this problem is. But in any event, Paris agreed on a 2-degree trajectory, which science shows isn't right. We need a 1.5. We need to keep overall global heating to 1.5 degrees, no more. So under Mayor Paes, C40 said, in order to be a member of C40, and stay a member, not only do you need to be a major city whose mayor is committed to doing their share of helping the world avoid climate breakdown, you have to have a climate plan that is 1.5 degrees compliant, which means doing your fair share of halving by 2030 on a path to net zero by 2050. And if you're in the global north, you need to peak by 2020. And so that program was called Deadline 2020. And the idea is if you don't have that, you're asked to leave C40. Some cities have. There's been a little bit of leeway because COVID, particularly in the global south, made it more difficult for cities to put the resources into climate planning when they were struggling to survive as entities. But the vast majority of C40 cities have a climate plan compliant with those criteria. It's consistent with science. It shows how the city geographic area, not the city government, the city geographic area is going to dramatically lower its emissions, halving by 2030 on a path to net zero by 2050. And one of the ideas behind C40, in addition to the fact that the mayors of the world's major cities have a really strong bully pulpit, C40 membership today, the regions around those cities, if you include that population, probably about 800 million. So it's like a huge country. One of the ideas was those cities have the expertise and the money to break through. And when they break through with a good idea, that can be shared with smaller cities and towns. And it's a way that ideas can multiply very quickly. So Denmark, for example, Copenhagen's a member of C40, not because it's a big city, but because it's such an innovative city doing really great things about climate. C40, in partnership with the Danish philanthropy, Real Dania, created a program to take that idea of having a climate plan, 1.5 degree compliant, and virtually every Danish city and town has such a climate plan now. 2 years ago in Glasgow, over 1,000 cities joined the city's race to zero. Mayor Eric Garcetti from Los Angeles was the C40 chair, and he really pushed this to try and get these ideas of a climate plan consistent with science and what urban areas can do about it into the hands of cities and towns, large and small. And their obligation through the city's race to zero is to essentially have a 1.5 degree compliant plan, doing your share of having by 2030 net zero by 2050. And you have to set out the areas you're going to act in. And the good news from this perspective is we know the areas that make a real difference from an urban perspective. It's transportation, buildings, how we build them, how we heat and cool them, where they are, sort of urban planning context to that, how we manage our waste, and in particular, do we compost our wet waste and capture the methane, and how we generate our electricity. Is it from clean sources? And the other good news is that there are actions happening somewhere in a city on each of those areas that is making a real difference. The less good news is the ideas aren't spreading at the pace that we need them to. And particularly in the global south, the funding is not spreading at a pace that allows cities to really innovate in the ways they want to. There's a lot of innovation happening. Accra in Ghana has really interesting innovation around waste. Freetown in Sierra Leone has very interesting innovation around nature, a program called Freetown, the Tree Town. But money, particularly from the international financial system like the World Bank, would really make a very large difference. So C40 today, let's give you a background on what it's trying to do, has two missions: to help the world get off fossil fuels in order to halt climate breakdown by eliminating half of the fossil fuels consumed in C40 cities consumed by 2030, and supporting mayors to win the global argument for renewables. So using the actions and the voices of the mayors, and to address the impacts and injustice of climate breakdown by creating jobs, by unlocking funding for climate resilience, particularly in global south cities, And by making climate a public health issue, because it is, and mayors have an important bully pulpit to demonstrate to people the really significant health impacts of fossil fuel-based pollution and how to solve them. And we've seen that. I'll get some examples. So how are these cities doing it? Well, they're taking bold actions. This chart, you don't need to read all the chart. I just included it here to give you a sense that this is a global movement. This isn't about a few cities in Europe and a few cities in the United States and Toronto, Montreal making change. It's a global movement for change in cities, including cities that are in the global south and the developing world. And I'm going to try to give some examples based on that argument that it's about these areas of transportation, buildings, including planning, waste management, and clean energy, and a couple of other things that are happening in cities. So, transportation really matters, and there's different ways of looking at this. One is about trying to use the space we have for people instead of cars. And, post World War II, there was a real push to build our cities, our communities, our towns, our provinces, our states around the automobile. And we know that there are lots of reasons that didn't really work. It's very expensive, causes a lot of pollution. And so, how do we build our cities around people and meeting their needs? Part of that's around public transport. And even in public transport, when you have excellent public transport, there's a need to green the fleets. And, just to give you an example of going slow, until very recently, Toronto had a pilot project to buy electric buses for the TTC. We had 60. Shenzhen, China has 16,000, and their entire fleet of buses has been electric for 6 years. And they were very, very smart. They use this not just as a climate measure. And by the way, even if you're using very polluting sources for your electricity, the overall impact is still positive if your transportation has no tailpipe pollution. But they also used it as a really effective industrial strategy. So the world's biggest manufacturer of electric buses is in Shenzhen, China. It's called Build Your Dreams, or BYD. It's now building factories in places like South America, California, to supply buses elsewhere. And when C40 started working on this issue in about, 2015, and when we spoke to bus manufacturers in North America and Europe, they said, we're decades away from this. We can't do it. And the mayor said, well, we're going to procure electric buses anyway. And now there's over 66,000 electric buses on the streets of C40 cities alone, many more if you look at other cities. It's a proven technology. It's proven in cold weather. It works, and huge reducer of carbon. And as you can see from the slide, Shenzhen's also electrifying its taxis. And that's within the power. City Hall in Toronto could say, to get a taxi or a Lyft license, you need to have an electric vehicle. It's quite possible. It's possible to say to the post office and to Amazon and everybody else that you need to have non-polluting vehicles in your fleet. There's also some interesting examples in other cities that go against stereotypes, I think. At least for me, if I picture Mexico City, I picture kind of traffic chaos. They're really pushing on this link between poor air quality and bad public health outcomes, and really pushing active travel, including this as a bike rental program like we have in Toronto. Related to this, of course, is not just whether you have clean buses and you have active transportation, it's how you build your cities. Do you build them around public transport in a dense urban form, or do we continue to build sprawled-based cities? And for me, this was one of the reasons why the debate about the green belt in Ontario is so important. The debate became a debate about the corruption of the Ford government, and fair enough, the way developers who were closely connected to Mr. Ford or attended his daughter's wedding and gave her huge gifts, financial gifts, that certainly had the taint of corruption, and we'll see what the RCMP says about it. But underlying that debate is a debate about whether we densify our cities or we continue to use Class 1 farmland for spread out car-based sprawl. And if we want to solve our environmental challenges, it's really clear that cities that are dense, that are built around public transit, that are walkable, sometimes called 15-minute cities, produce far lower emissions. They also produce places that economically thrive. The small business strips like Bloor West Village, where I'm near today, do much better when there's a dense population, and there are better health outcomes. So by ensuring that cities are dense, we actually don't just fight climate change, we build cities that are better places for people to live and give them the option of not having to drive everywhere, unlike sprawl-based development where you have to. You don't really have a choice. Here's some examples of things that are happening. Portland, Oregon, trying to help create housing supply by densifying single-family residential neighborhoods. Curitiba, Brazil, amazing. I can't. The mayor there could give a 3 or 4 hour lecture about their history of amazing things that have happened in Curitiba. Under previous mayor, Jaime Lerner, they essentially invented bus rapid transit. But they've got to a stage where they really think about how do we densify our city around public transport and also ensure that there's green space and other urban amenities for people. Because if you have a dense city, you need better public space. And they're very successful. You can see these figures, 85% of the population use their bus rapid transit. It's quite remarkable. And that's well in excess of North American cities for sure. Other actions linking the needs, the stated needs of populations in a city with actions that help reduce carbon emissions. Interesting programs in several South African cities trying to address social inequality through policies that also promote either density or better transportation choices. This is Johannesburg under a previous Mayor DeLille. Cape Town quite famously wanted to supply solar housing in a variety of ways, including to lower income communities, and they sued the national government for the right to be able to do that because the regulations said they couldn't. So a lot happening from that perspective as well. And I mentioned the 15-minute city. Basically, a 15-minute city is a city built up of neighborhoods where people can live in a way they don't have to own a car. They can own one, but they don't have to. And these kinds of cities produce better economic outputs, better health outputs, better climate outputs. And they're the kind of places where people often want to live because they have neighborhood-based, in the UK they call them high streets, that are economically successful because there's enough density and enough people within walking distance, i.e. the idea is you're within 15 minutes of everything you need, your job, shopping, education opportunities, religious worship, et cetera, et cetera. I think of it as a city of neighborhoods like we think of Toronto. And that idea has spread with different names all over the world, as you can see from that in that chart. So within a dense city or even a sprawl-based city, the quality of the buildings and how we build them really matters for a bunch of reasons. One is our buildings are an important source of employment. And if energy retrofits of old buildings, for example, are a really strong source of good jobs. typically well-paid buildings, trades, jobs, and in many countries in the world, unionized. Huge chunk of city-based emissions comes from buildings. Across C40, it's 35%, but in New York, it used to be 80% before some steps they took. In Toronto, it was 60% before the city acted. And buildings, to me, are a low-hanging fruit, because we can build buildings now to virtually net zero standards. There are carbon positive buildings. Economically, it's very clear, zero emission standards is economic, and in certain places carbon positive. But we don't, because our building codes don't require us to, and the building industry is rarely going to do much more than the building codes. Toronto has a green building standard that's quite helpful here and really pushes the industry. But to me, this is low-hanging fruit. And unfortunately, people love to talk about electric cars or electric buses or wind turbines or solar, but rarely about the biggest single thing we can do, which is make sure our buildings use very little energy to heat and cool. Food, some articles in the press today about the lobbying from the meat industry at this COP. But it's very clear that the world faces two conflicting trends. One is that massive numbers of people don't have enough to eat. And the second is that those who do have enough to eat are eating diets that often include far too much meat, and the production of meat, particularly cows, is a huge climate challenge. So if we were able to transform people's diets generally to a much less meat-based diet, we also might be able to find ways to use land to ensure that people weren't suffering from hunger. A very important and emerging area. So one more general thing, and then I'm going to speak a little bit about Toronto, and then try to tie this together for things that Rotary can do. And then look forward to questions and conversations, whether about my presentation or otherwise. One of the new things that's happening in the city space is something called climate budgeting, in which a city looks at the city operations. Now, remember, the climate plans are about the city as a whole. A climate budget looks at the city operations and says within that city-based climate plan, what's the maximum amount of emissions that our city can emit? And then says, and this was pioneered by Oslo, but other cities are starting to look at it, including Montreal and Toronto, and then looks at that and says to the city departments, this is the amount of carbon we have this year. The same way we have a set amount of money, and you need to apply for your carbon allocation if you want to build a new pool or community center, recreation facility, the same way you have to apply for money, and the city finance department is going to run it. And that embeds climate action across all the departments. And if the amount of carbon you need means the city is going to exceed its carbon allowance for the year, you don't get to do your project. It's a really transformative idea. And if we can take it from, a few cities doing it to something that's quite common, I think that will put massive pressure on provincial governments and the federal government to do the same thing, national governments, and really say, be honest about it. This activity is emitting this much carbon, and we can't afford that in the same way we couldn't if we didn't have the money. Really, I think, very interesting approach. If you read up on Oslo, you'll see they haven't quite hit their carbon reduction targets, but on the other hand, their targets were some of the most advanced in the world. They're way ahead of everybody else. And one of the reasons for that is this approach. So how does this all come together? Toronto is a good example. By the way, maybe I'll go back to that. Whoops. Oh, no, I can't go backwards. So in 2007, Toronto created a climate plan. It was called Changes in the Air. It passed city council unanimously, and I can tell you that as mayor, it was very difficult to get a unanimous vote. The vote immediately after the climate plan was the introduction of the land transfer tax. And that was not unanimous, but it's why I remember that the climate plan was unanimous. The climate plan had recommendations about all these areas, about buildings, about densifying the city, about transportation, and funding, and all sorts of actions. And I can go into that in detail if people are interested, but I wanted to highlight one part of it and why I'm such a believer of city-based climate action. Because in the climate plan, it said we have to have a rapid transit network. You know, Toronto has good subways and good streetcars, but it's not a network. And in many parts of the city, in the sense that it's not a network in the sense that in many parts of the city, you almost have to drive. You can't easily take rapid transit, particularly in Northeast Scarborough, northwest of Etobicoke. So that network that was proposed in the climate plan was worked on by the Toronto Transit Commission experts and our planning experts, and they developed what we called Transit City at the time, which was a network of light rail, predominantly at grade, although Eglinton in the center of the city had to be tunneled. It was light rail at grade because in the suburban areas, the density didn't require a subway, and because it's about a sixth of the cost. And the idea behind that was to build a transportation network so that people didn't have to use cars, and therefore lower emissions, but also to allow development to come in the city, because when you have permanent rail-based transportation, the private sector will grow. So it was a bulwark against sprawl. Sorry, I'm talking too fast. In an effort to build a much denser city in the parts that weren't dense. But it was also a social development strategy, because the plan was developed through an analysis of where there were opportunities for new buildings for densification, but also where the busiest bus routes were. And those busiest bus routes served the lowest income neighborhoods in the city. We called them priority investment neighborhoods because they were a priority for public investment. As a government, we made them a priority. And those lines served these neighborhoods, which, if you think about it, isn't really a surprise. Many of them look like that in Toronto. And, you know, you can see the confluence of those high density Tower and a Park neighborhoods with the proposed lines on this chart. And when we were consulting with people, I took the bus in from Malvern one morning, got there about 6 a.m. with my then assistant Clive. We took the Malvern bus down to the Shepherd bus, and all these glossy brochures. And I sat down beside this woman. She said, "Mayor, what are you doing on my bus?" I said, "I'm here to talk about the Shepherd LRT." She said, "What's the Shepherd LRT?" And I said, "It's kind of a above ground subway. It runs in the middle of the road in its own right of way, so it doesn't get stuck in rush hour traffic, unlike the bus. And it will come much more frequently. It'll be faster, and it'll get you where you want to go, much more likely to be on time." And she said, "Oh, that'd be great." And I said, "Where are you going?" She said, the airport, Pearson Airport. That's where I work. I said, "How do you get there?" And she said, "Well, I was on the Malvern bus, Shepherd subway, Young subway, Finch bus, and then the Moulton bus." That takes you a long time. "Oh yes, it's 2 hours, Mayor, as long as I make my connections, but in the winter sometimes I miss them." You have a really long day. Well, that's only my morning job. In the afternoons, I work at the Royal York Hotel. I'm a cleaner. If you think about that woman's day and the reason and the impact, the positive impact this transit plan that came out of the city's climate plan would have on her, you know, it might free up as much of an hour of her time. And she might get home in time to have dinner with her family. She might get home to go to the public meeting and say, "You know what? I want the LRT. The one-stop subway extension isn't going to help me." So she might be able to participate in the democratic life of her city. Or she might be able to do what my mom did, which was go back to school. And my mom graduated from university when she was 56. And, you know, this woman lives near Centennial College, University of Toronto, Scarborough. Maybe she could upgrade her skills enough to get one permanent full-time job if she had time, but she can't even consider that now because she's stuck on the bus. And to me, that's the biggest reason why city-based climate action has traction. Because when mayors build a city around a good climate plan, they're actually addressing the needs of the residents, not just for walkable dense cities, but for jobs and to meet the social needs of the city. And this is illustrated by Regent Park, which when it was revitalized, the people who lived there were approached right at the beginning and were told, look, your housing is the end of life. We've got to build new stuff. What do you want? They said, we want jobs for our young people. If you're going to invest $1 billion, how do the people that live here get some of those jobs? They said, we like our neighborhood, but if we get a better job, we have to move out. Is there a way to build middle income housing here? And they also said, we want to live in environmentally sustainable housing. And I think that goes against the stereotype of people who live in rent-geared to income housing. They said, we want sustainability. And when Regent Park was rejuvenated, it was built in a way that was very low energy use through district energy, which is common in Europe, but rare here. My final point so that's sort of a highlight of what's happening globally, a bit about Toronto. And by the way, as a result of Toronto's plans and the province closing the Lakeview Power Station, which was coal-fired, but supplied Toronto, particularly for peaking in the summer, Toronto's, as a geographic area, is over 30% below its greenhouse gas emissions from 1990. So we are a test case that it works. So where does Rotary come in? Well, Rotary, many of Rotary's clubs are urban-based, if not most. So there is a way to collaborate between clubs and cities. There's also a way to think about this city-based climate action much more on a neighborhood basis through tools like the ecological footprint, which is global, but it's based here in York University. It has techniques to help us think about environmental impacts beyond climate, including other things like biodiversity, on a sub-city level. And I think there are ways that Rotarians could contribute, perhaps using the ecological footprint, perhaps otherwise, because of the superb reputation Rotary has globally as people who are trying to make a difference in matters that in issues that really matter. And climate change is going to drive tens, if not hundreds of millions of people off the land soon, whether it's from wildfires, floods, extreme heat, or increasing desertification in Africa. We're already seeing people on the move to urban areas. There couldn't be a bigger crisis. And whether it's at the city scale, or perhaps using tools like the ecological footprint to think about the neighborhood scale, there is a way for Rotary clubs to make a real difference. And I hope we can build a collaboration. So that's really what I wanted to say today. I went a couple of minutes long. I apologize, but I look forward to the questions and conversation, and I'll stop sharing now. And thank you for the opportunity, by the way, Dawn. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So we have a couple of questions so far. One is, what about the Eglinton Crosstown subway? It's still not running.
So I have a particular view on that. I was concerned, having been involved in municipal politics for quite a while, I knew the propensity of projects to start and not get finished. So we worked incredibly hard to get things going between 2007, when we reached agreement with the province for funding for Transit City, in 2010 when I left office. And when I left office, the TTC had done somewhere between 60 and 70% of the engineering for the Eglinton Crosstown. It could have gone for bids, but the province decided that it didn't want the TTC to build the project. It wanted to control it. So it canceled that. We'd probably spent $100 million on that engineering and started over again with a public-private partnership, which it claimed would be more efficient. It obviously hasn't been, and had all the bidders, well, the shortlisted bidders, redo the engineering. And unfortunately, they were told at the time this was too big a project to put out as one project to a public-private consortium. Nobody could handle that. It was just too big. And they didn't take that advice. And so there was a 3-year delay while they redid everything. And then the project has proved to be very difficult for one consortium to handle. It should have been broken into well, it should have been done by the TTC, but if you weren't going to do that, it should have been broken into parts that they could handle more easily, and also would invite more bids and bidders and be more competitive. The only good news is there is a bit of light, and it will open.
Eventually. Tom Lohner, you have a question? You can go off mute. Tom, we can't hear you. Can you go off mute?
There we go. Thank you for the great presentation. I wanted to ask sort of it's a different spin on what you presented. It seems to me that, you know, when you look at the doubling of population, let's say, for example, in Africa, and, you know, of course, that's a trend that's happening all over the world. And with urbanization rates and the infrastructure, particularly in the developing cities, being totally inadequate as it exists today, and with the notion that if cities continue to grow, like for instance, I'll take for example like Nairobi, you know, which the infrastructure there is way undersized. They don't have the tax bases to build the infrastructure like it should be. They don't have the bonding capabilities. Thus, you know, the infrastructure's going to, you know, become worse and worse. And when you look at that from a climate change standpoint, you know, it's just, you know, it's a disaster waiting to happen. Wouldn't it make sense to come up with an alternative approach to dealing with, instead of having, you know, large, dense cities, maybe promote an alternative model where you have, you know, city centers that are located outside of major urban environments that provide the same levels of you know, amenities that families are looking for, and working with the local governments to, you know, generate jobs that you know, will provide for the families and the populations in those areas, and then use mass transportation to interconnect the nodes. You know, so it's more of a decentralized approach to growth, that where these new urban centers can be designed to be carbon zero from the ground up, as opposed to trying to do catch up in the current city centers. And I think one last point is COVID kind of proved that people can work and profit for their companies pretty much anywhere they have, you know, high-speed internet access. So anyhow, I'm just that's just an observation of mine. I've actually been promoting for some time, but it's kind of hard to get the right people engaged to appreciate, you know, that particular paradigm.
I don't disagree with what you said, although I see it slightly differently. So I think there is a lot of merit, particularly post-COVID, in supporting the densification of places like Hamilton or London, Ontario, or Barrie, places that are real places, but in some cases, you know, a lot of the small business strips in London have died over the years because of terrible, in my view, terrible planning decisions. I think there's all sorts of room to densify those kinds of cities. I think trying to build new cities in a place like Africa is really challenging, in the sense of, is that where people are going to go? And I can't answer that question. I don't have enough expertise about Africa, but I can say that the mayors of our African cities, none of them have suggested the idea of satellite cities as a solution for the mass migrations that are coming to the outside. So it's not, I'm not saying it means it's a wrong idea in their context, but it's not on their radar. And I'll test that with my African colleagues. I mean, from my perspective, as long as you're building real places that are relatively dense and people don't have to own a car, and we're not building suburban style subdivisions, then I think you are onto something. But those migrations are very challenging because they're happening every day while we're all talking about this. So I'll test that with my African colleagues. It's a really interesting thought in their context.
And one last thing I'll mention is that the cost of real estate in those cities are so outrageous that the average family can't afford to live in the cities, which ends up essentially expanding the slums, because that's the only place a lot of them can live. And they come to the cities with the hope that there's greener pastures, jobs, shopping malls, movie theaters, which of course, those kinds of things turn out to be not such a great reason to want to move. but it's I mean, it's kind of a catch-22, but there is no alternative. It's either stay at the small scale farm with mom and dad where there's nothing going on, or I go to the city. So I think that there needs to be some middle ground that could definitely be a big resource for those cities. And then, when you look at, again, their population is supposed to double by 2050. If they follow the linear economy model of the developed world, which is what they're doing, they're going to, pollute so much that whatever good we do in the cities like what you're promoting, they'll, we're going nowhere as a result. So anyway, it's just, I think it's something that really needs to be taken a hard look at.
And in addition to that, there needs to be significant financial support for a development model around clean energy in places like Africa. And for a variety of reasons, there's very little money flowing, particularly to city governments. And we've had programs in partnership with the World Bank and others to try and produce the capacity to do things like bond issues. Very challenging, as I think you pointed out. Yeah. But there is a way for this to happen that is like the cell phone. Africa didn't go all lines; they had a leap, and the forces that are necessary to fight are really the oil industry, which is seeing Africa as a place it can exploit now and promising gold and everything. So it's a very big political challenge, but there is massive potential for all kinds of clean energy. And if the future can be built that way, it changes the trajectory you were speaking to.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I agree. We got to move on and let other people ask questions, okay? We have a question from a person who lives in Wisconsin. He said, none of our cities are C40 cities. How do we leverage the power of Rotary to get them to participate?
I think David's already answered that in the chat there. But Larry has another question there. Can you comment on the role and need for green jobs to implement these strategies? Baby boomers are aging out there, and there is a skilled labor shortage in the building trades.
First of all, absolutely, we need green jobs. My political view on this is the mistake that the climate movement has made is to talk about, first of all, green jobs is a bit amorphous. So the idea needs to be quite specific. But secondly, my view is people get afraid for their job. And you're a pipe fitter in a city where a good part of your work is servicing the pipes or installing them in apartment buildings. you may support climate action, but if the most important thing in your city is decarbonizing those apartment buildings, you're going to fight it because it's your job, and you're earning, $65 an hour with union benefits and protections. You're going to fight as much as you can. So my view is you need a very granular program to say what replaces the pipe fitters jobs, or how do we repurpose the pipe fitters around things like geothermal, or how do we have that group of people actually get these green jobs? So, for example, in the United States context, I think if the Obama administration had brought wind turbine manufacturing plants to West Virginia, even though it would have required a significant amount of government action, you might have changed the debate. And we're actually starting to see some of that happen in the Southeast US. But to me, that's the real answer. It's not just having the green jobs. That's great. But it's making sure the people whose jobs are at risk in the industries that have to decline if we're going to solve the problem actually see a path for themselves and have a path to get equivalent, decent, dignified work.
Okay. Craig Armstrong, you had a question?
Oh, yes, please. Thank you very much. Yeah, just in terms of the food supply that you mentioned, can you speak to regenerative agriculture? There's a very distinct difference between meat that comes from cows that are naturally raised on grass, and they poop on the ground and regenerate the soil, versus cattle that have been pumped full of antibiotics and so on and so forth. So getting people off meat is maybe not the best path forward, but can you speak to that?
A bit. I'm more comfortable speaking about transportation and buildings, but I would argue that lowering meat consumption generally is a positive thing, both from a health perspective and a climate perspective. But I accept your point. The industrial agriculture, in a variety of ways, not just in the meat industry, really is an enemy of climate change. And there is a very interesting project I just read about, where a farmer of his own volition is capturing the manure to prevent methane escaping from it, and using that methane in a way that's far lower impact from a climate perspective. So if I take your general point as, is our biggest concern the industrial scale agriculture in the meat industry, I would say yes, absolutely. And are there examples of more local small scale farming that is less impactful on the planet and therefore preferable? Absolutely. But beyond that, you're getting to the limit of my knowledge.
Yeah, and same thing for fruits and vegetables. There's a good way to grow them, and then there's the spraying a whole bunch of pesticides and degrading the soil type way to grow them as well.
And I think your point raises an important point. I tend to see all this through the lens of climate and city building because that's my background. But there are other environmental issues that we really need to worry about. And, that's the beauty of the ecological footprint, because it looks implicitly at things like, how do we grow our food? And are we overusing pesticides and other materials that have an impact on biodiversity and all sorts of other things in soil health? And there are really serious concerns beyond climate that the kind of approach I think you're recommending addresses in important ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much for your time, David. Really appreciate the presentation.
Thanks, Craig. Your intervention was really interesting. I appreciate that too.
I think he's addressed most questions. Do we have any more? And otherwise, we'll. Jackie, you have a question? You're on mute. You're on mute.
Okay. I can attest firsthand the wonderful rapport you have with young people. And I guess my question is, has C40, do you offer any internships for students or any resources to kind of motivate them and bring them on board?
We do have a youth program that connects very directly with youth. And what we try to do is give them a voice. So, for example, at our last summit, which was in Buenos Aires, our opening ceremony was the chair of C40, Sadiq Khan, a woman mayor, I think probably Mayor Aki Sawyer from Freetown, our host mayor from Buenos Aires, and a young person from Nigeria who spoke about the impact she sees in her country on climate change. She was amazing. The room could hear a pin drop. So that's one thing we do, is systematically give young people a platform to speak to these issues from their perspective. And we do work with them on their remarks, but we don't say you can't say that. It's their voice. We do say you've only got 5 minutes. And there's a formal youth cabinet and things like that, and it connects with the youth cabinets in various cities. Second thing is, traditionally we have had internships. They tend to be for university level students, but we're rethinking our internship program at the moment because we found it was really easy to get interns from places like Toronto, but more difficult to get interns from places like Accra. And you know, as an international organization, we feel we have a duty to try to ensure that those opportunities are spread globally. So it's on hold, but at normal times, yes, we do. So those are the two things. We've got a youth program, and we do in normal times have an internship program. It's just on pause right now.
Thank you. Thank you.
And Jackie, now if we could have you thank our speaker.
Okay. Well, David, Jane Jacobs has said that designing a dream city is easy. Rebuilding a living city takes imagination. And you've demonstrated today that, as Neelam said, you're a man of action, but you have the imagination to lead the international community to develop the strategies to deal with climate change. And you've reminded us of the critical role that municipalities can play. I mean, it's the municipal level of government that looks after housing and trees and waste, and its citizens expect action, although they're not always keen to vote. But nevertheless, they're important. Cities indeed are the incubators of great ideas. You've also reminded us that cities have taken action to address climate change. Cities are, because they are experiencing the impact of climate change. You mentioned Houston, New York, New Orleans, and whatever. We're just so pleased that you gave your very valuable time to talk to us today. And we're very excited about the Rotary connection that you've outlined. And Toronto Eglinton would just love to give you a home here. And so we're really looking forward, David, to continuing this dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity. I look forward to collaborating in future and seeing you all again.
Thank you. And Neelam, you had a last word there.
Well, thank you, David, again. And I know we could spend more time talking about specific Rotary and C40 affiliation, then we'll continue to do that. And you mentioned the footprint tracker, and I am working at the district and internationally to make that happen, pilot that within clubs. We have an initiative called Every Club Climate Friendly. I'm also working with the folks at York University. But your engagement in this whole area is just amazing. And in recognition of that, I think our club would like to present to you the Paul Harris Award. Symbolically at this point, we don't have that in person, but we'll make arrangements to have that. And the Paul Harris Award, if you don't know, is one of the awards that Rotary gives out to people who have done significant work in making inroads into the needs of humanity. So we are pleased to do that, and this is probably the first of many more interactions together. Thank you again.
I'm a bit flabbergasted by that honor, so thank you, and thank you to everyone who's applauding on mute. I really appreciate that, and I look forward to continued collaboration. But more importantly, thank you for all the efforts Rotary makes and you each make through Rotary to make a difference in people's lives. You're incredibly effective, and I hope everybody realizes how effective and important Rotary is. So thank you all for that.
Thank you.
Bye.
And now we're finished.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming and listening.